This video is about a Popperian aesthetics, which was created by Tomas Kulka. I'll be reading an article called Art and Science, an outline of a Popperian aesthetics. This was written in the British Journal of Aesthetics in 1989. I will give some personal commentary on this. I do think that Tomas Kulka had a very interesting aesthetic theory and a very interesting approach that I like, but I also think he got some very crucial things wrong. So I will point some of those things out, but I won't go too deep into all of the errors that he's making. I just want to really understand his perspective and his approach to a Popperian aesthetics. Of course, the goal here is to really understand different aesthetic theories, and in particular, the aesthetic theories that can lead to aesthetic optimism. We'll see if we have the seed of optimism within Tomas Kulka's aesthetic theory. Although Sir Karl Popper is likely to be remembered mainly as a philosopher of science, his contribution to philosophy ranges from logic, philosophy of mathematics, epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of mind, to social theory, philosophy of history, moral and political philosophy. The distinct unity of Popper's thought enables one to speak of a Popperian Weltanschauung, a comprehensive philosophical system comparable to those of the classical philosophers. Weltanschauung means worldview. It's a very funny word that I think about Kurt Jai-Mongol saying this word often because he likes the word Weltanschauung. At least he used to.
Weltanschauung.
Weltanschauung. Weltan, maybe. There's just one philosophical discipline which has not been systematically explored by Popper, namely aesthetics. The purpose of this essay is to suggest an outline of a Popperian aesthetics. I shall try to show that the main ideas of Popper's philosophy of science can be adapted to the philosophy of art. In section 1, I will suggest that the principle of falsifiability, which plays a central role in Popper's philosophy of science, can be applied to aesthetics. The relation between a hypothesis and basic statements, which serve as the base for Popperian testing, will be shown in section 2 to have its aesthetic analog, suggesting that aesthetic value judgments are, in a certain sense, testable. In section 3, the asymmetry between the verification and falsification of scientific hypotheses will be shown to be analogous to the asymmetry between the justification of positive and negative aesthetic value judgments. It will also be suggested that good works of art are more falsifiable than bad ones, in the sense that the former are easier to spoil and more difficult to improve than the latter. This intuition will be developed in section 4 into a quantitative model of aesthetic evaluation. Popper's conception of collaboration will be applied to the model in order to show that it may also have practical implications for art criticism. This model, which will be presented in the schematic form of an algebraic formula, should be seen as a rational reconstruction of aesthetic value judgments, which is intended to lay bare their basic logical structure. The 3 components of the proposed formula will be interpreted as suggestions for explication of the classical concepts of unity, complexity, and intensity, concepts that have hitherto been understood only on the purely intuitive level as primitive concepts. The internal structure of these concepts will thereby become transparent. As a starting point, I would like to take up Nelson Goodman's suggestion that aesthetic excellence is better understood in terms of rightness rather than in terms of beauty. Following Goodman, I shall speak of good works of art as being right and bad works of art as being wrong. Now, where do we have footnotes? Ooh. I don't like this one bit. We have footnotes all the way at the end, so we're going to skip all the footnotes because it's just difficult to go all the way to the end. One of the reasons for the preference of, so just reading about this, Goodman's preference of calling things right rather than beautiful. One of the reasons for this preference is that many great works of art, like Picasso's Guernica or Kafka's The Trial, can hardly be described as beautiful. I've not read Kafka's The Trial, but I've seen Orson Welles' movie. I personally, of course, like the word beautiful, and I like it because of the classical 3 transcendentals from Greek philosophy: truth, goodness, and beauty. I want to talk about what's beautiful. Anyway, however, instead of linking aesthetic rightness to projectability or entrenchment, as Goodman does, I propose to analyze aesthetic rightness in terms of falsifiability. The proposed analogy could be outlined as follows. In Popper's philosophy of science, the concept of falsifiability plays basically a twofold role. One, it serves as a demarcation criterion between propositions of a scientific and proposition of a non-scientific character. And two, a degree of falsifiability serves as a measure of epistemic or scientific worth. I shall try to show that the concept of aesthetic falsifiability can be constructed so as to perform essentially an analogous dual function. One, to serve as a demarcation criterion between aesthetic and non-aesthetic character. And two, the degree of falsifiability can serve as a measure of aesthetic worth. Before proceeding any further, let me explain the analogy between scientific and aesthetic falsifiability. Okay, I like this so far. So aesthetic falsifiability will be used in two ways. One, in order to demarcate between aesthetic and non-aesthetic characters. And two, as a measure of aesthetic value. Before proceeding any further, let me explain the analogy between scientific and aesthetic falsifiability. The basic idea behind Popper's demarcation criterion is quite simple. A hypothesis is scientific only insofar as it is falsifiable. This means that there must be some logically possible states of affairs which are prohibited by the hypothesis. It must be possible that the hypothesis could clash with some conceivable experience. Or, as Popper puts it, every scientific theory is a prohibition. It forbids certain things to happen. A theory which is not refutable by any conceivable event is non-scientific. Irrefutable is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Non-scientific hypotheses, such as God exists, for example, are not refutable or falsifiable, since this hypothesis does not put constraints on any conceivable states of affairs. Popper's contention that the degree of falsifiability can serve as a measure of empirical content, and thus as an a priori measure of scientific or epistemic worth, is also quite simple. Science is seeking theories which are highly informative, rich in their empirical content, theories which have high predictive and explanatory power. But such theories are also highly falsifiable, since a failure of any part of their predictions amounts to their falsification. Theories which have high predictive power are rich in their empirical content and run a greater risk of clashing with observations or experimental results. The empirical content of a theory is thus proportionally related to the number of its potential falsifiers. The more the theory says, the more falsifiable it is. Thus, a good scientific theory is one which is highly falsifiable but has not so far been falsified. Popper also characterizes the ideal scientific theory in terms of optimal falsifiability. Let me quote again. Let us now imagine we are given a theory and that the sector representing the basic statements which it forbids becomes wider and wider. Ultimately, the basic statements not forbidden by the theory will be represented by a narrow sector. A theory like this would be very easy to falsify, since it allows the empirical world only a narrow range of possibilities, for it rules out almost all conceivable, meaning logically possible, events. It asserts so much about the world of experiences, its empirical content is so great that there is, as it were, little chance for it to escape falsification. All the events or classes of occurrences which we actually encounter and observe, and only those would be characterized as permitted. An ideal scientific theory would thus be one which is maximally falsifiable, yet so far actually unfalsified. Let us now turn to the concept of aesthetic rightness and see how the principles of Popper's falsificationism can be applied to its analysis. What could it mean to say that a work of art is right? Since this concept allows for degrees, let us first consider the limiting case of absolute rightness. To say that a work is absolutely right is to say that it has no shortcomings. The notion of absolute rightness clearly implies the absence of deficiencies of any sort whatsoever. This, in turn, means that every constitutive feature of the work is in its place, exactly where it should be. A work cannot be improved, for if it could, it wouldn't be quite right. It can, on the other hand, be easily impaired, spoiled, damaged, or falsified by alterations of its constitutive features. Okay, I like this already. We have a notion of what it means for a work of art to be right. Now, I like it because it's interesting, but I also don't like it because I think fundamentally that the work of art should not be the thing that is analogous to a scientific theory. I really think that there's things within the work of art. There are parts within a work of art that are the things that are analogous to a scientific theory. And those are the things which could be falsified or not falsified. But that's just how I see it. I don't think looking at the entire work of art altogether is the appropriate approach. The link between the concept of aesthetic rightness and that of falsifiability is, I think, beginning to surface here. Obviously, Popper's concept of falsifiability cannot be applied to aesthetics literally, for works of art are not statements that can be contradicted by observation reports or rendered false by states of affairs. But by analogy between the ideal scientific theory and an ideal work of art suggests itself nevertheless. For we could say that an ideal work of art is maximally falsifiable in the sense that any alterations of its features would cause an aesthetic damage, meaning it would make it somewhat wrong or false. We could also say that an ideal work of art forbids any departures or deviations from its actual forms. Thus, all those features that such a work actually exemplifies, and only those, could be characterized as permitted. A deviation from the actual form of a work of art, which would be aesthetically beneficial, would, ipso facto, point to some shortcomings, as the actual falsification of a scientific theory by a forbidden event shows that something is wrong with the theory. Likewise, an alteration which would improve a given work of art would show that there is something wrong with that work of art. Since by definition an absolutely right work of art does not allow for such alterations, an ideal work of art, like an ideal scientific theory, could be said to be maximally falsifiable, yet actually unfalsified. So it just means that any change would make it worse. I like this. An absolutely right work of art is thus one which can only be spoiled but not improved by alterations. The opposite limiting extreme in absolutely wrong work of art could be conceived as one which can only be improved but not spoiled by alterations. The two limiting cases may have no real instances. We can, nevertheless, assume a continuum between the two extremes, a continuum on which real works of art can be projected. Exquisite works of art could be considered as being relatively close to the limiting case of maximally falsifiable, yet actually unfalsified works, since such works would be easy to spoil but difficult to improve. Good works of art could thus be said in this case to be more falsifiable than bad ones, and hence the degree of falsifiability could be seen as a measure of aesthetic rightness. So the best works of art, things could go wrong. Many things could go wrong. It is evident that works of art could, in principle, be improved or damaged by alterations. However, it is also possible that some alterations are aesthetically inconsequential. That is, that some changes or transformations would neither improve nor spoil the aesthetic quality of the work. For example, transposing the tune of Frère Jacques from C major to, say, F major would be unlikely to affect its aesthetic qualities, whatever they may be. I don't know what that tune is. Oh, Frère Jacques. Actually, I do know that one. I just pronounced it wrong. It is important to note, however, that this cannot be true for every transformation or alteration of a work of art. For clarity, if no alteration of the constitutive features would affect the aesthetic quality of an object, the object could hardly be said to function aesthetically. We could say that such an object would be in principle unfalsifiable in the sense that no alteration would either damage or improve it. But if no departure from the actual form of the object would make any aesthetic difference, we couldn't but conclude that its form is not significant, that we do not consider it a work of art. Tomas Kulka has this whole notion of what kitsch is, and he just described it. A work of art or an object that can't be aesthetically improved or disproved, improved or worsened, spoiled, would be kitsch. That's his definition of kitsch. I'm not sure if this paper was written before his usage of that word kitsch. He has like a whole book about it, but anyway, that's a whole other topic. Falsifiability in principle, the possibility of damaging and or improving a work of art by alterations, could thus be seen as a demarcation criterion of aesthetic character. An object can be considered a work of art only if it is effectively falsifiable in this sense. In the preceding section, we have noted that good works of art are actually more falsifiable than bad ones, but both good as well as bad works have to be falsifiable in principle in order to count as works of art. So far, we have been concerned with the semantic question. What does it mean to say that a work of art is right? Now let us turn to the epistemic question. How could we know that a work of art is right? What could inform our judgment about rightness and wrongness of works of art? Given the uniqueness of works of art, how could we justify claims about their rightness? The assessment of the aesthetic rightness of a work of art primarily consists of the assessment of how well its specific constitutive elements are integrated, or, as Richard Wollheim puts it, the coherence that we look for in a work of art is always relative to the elements that the artist is required to assemble within it. How could we then know whether the constitutive features of a given work of art are in their place, exactly where they should be? How could we, for example, justify a claim such as feature F of work W is or is not in its place, exactly where it should be or should not be? I suggest that we can back up such claim by juxtaposing the work W with its own variations or versions or alternatives which differ from work W only with respect to feature F. If we would find an alternative work W prime, which strikes us as aesthetically superior to the work W, we could infer that feature F is not quite in its place. If, on the other hand, all the alternatives turn out to be aesthetically inferior to work W, we may conclude that F is quite right. We could thus learn about rightness or wrongness of works of art by comparing them to their own versions. Alternatives which are inferior to W could be regarded as confirming instances of the claim that W is right, while those alternatives that are superior to W can be regarded as disconfirming instances of such judgment. We could thus say that aesthetic value judgment could be tested or justified by juxtaposing the work of art under consideration with its own alternatives. All right, I like this idea. It's like having a critical attitude towards a work of art, considering different alternatives. And when you have an alternative work of art, we can see which one is better or worse. It's interesting because I'm sure that a lot of people think that it is not good to have a critical attitude when approaching a work of art. In some cases, you should just assume that the work of art is the best version in order to properly appreciate it. But here, we seem to be getting a slightly different approach here. Though, in this case, we're just judging the rightness of the work of art, and he's not specifically talking about the appreciation of the work of art. You know, he's not clarifying if that's different or the same. I would think that they are very similar, perhaps the exact same thing, but he hasn't explicitly said that, so I guess it wouldn't be fair of me to say that Tomas Kulka also thinks that this sort of critical approach is the way to appreciate a work of art. In any case, I like this critical attitude. the attitude of testing alternatives. Section 2. Before proceeding any further, a few words should be said about the concept of alteration. Though this concept will figure prominently in much of what follows, I cannot, for reasons which would soon become apparent, offer anything like a formal definition, and the application of this key concept will ultimately rest upon our intuitive understanding. Let me, nevertheless, make a few remarks about the meaning of the term alteration in the sense in which it will be employed here. It's beautiful. I like that he's like pointing out the part of his theory that's vague, because most theories are going to have some parts that are vague. Good to bring them up front and say, this is going to be a vague part of my theory. And perhaps we could at some point make a formal definition, but currently, as far as Thomas can tell, it's not possible to have a formal definition. The notion of alteration clearly implies change, but evidently, not every change will count as an alteration. A change in a work of art, which could make it difficult to recognize the basic dominant features, would not normally be considered an alteration. Intuitively speaking, an alteration or an alternative of a given work of art can be said to exemplify one of its own unrealized possibilities. Ooh, that's interesting. The question is, when can we say that something exemplifies an unrealized possibility of a given work of art, rather than that we have two altogether different works of art? The answers will obviously differ from case to case, since the type and range of permissible alternatives will depend on the specific features of individual works. The type and range of permissible alterations will depend on the inner logic of the work, on what its dominant, determining, or essential features are, and what its subsidiary or accidental properties are. I see, essential features versus accidental features. I like this. We could say that every individual work suggests its own alternatives. Generally speaking, we may say that a change in a work of art will be considered an alteration only if it does not shatter its basic perceptual gestalt. A work will constitute an alternative or a version of another only if we can perceive the same basic gestalt in both. Man, again, okay, it's a little vague still. I like the notion of an inner logic of a work of art. This difference between features that are essential and accidental, I don't think I do like it, but it's interesting no less. Surely there are parts of a work of art. Of course, I don't usually think in terms of total works of art, so there's going to be a difference in how I think about this, generally speaking, but I think that works of art do have sort of load-bearing parts, which would not change and would be difficult to change. And then they have all these other parts which are not load-bearing and they can be changed. There's a range of different changes which will not make much of a difference. Are those subsidiary and accidental properties? Perhaps. It should be emphasized that we cannot offer a formal criterion for what is to count as an alteration. For this may depend on stylistic considerations, on perceiving the work in an appropriate category, or on the context of presentation, sometimes even the artist's intentions. It should thus be clear that the authority to determine whether a change in a work of art does or does not constitute an alteration ultimately rests in the art critic and not within the philosopher. Alternatives are conceived as being roughly of two kinds: those resulting from local changes and adjustments, where most of the constitutive elements are left intact, and two, those resulting from overall transformations, which may change all the constitutive elements while preserving their relations and structural properties. Making revisions in a musical piece, editing a poem, or retouching a photographic print would be examples of alterations of the first kind. Transposing a musical work into another key translating a poem, or making the photographic print larger or smaller would be examples of alterations of the second kind. Interesting. I'm not sure I like this differentiation of overall transformation, but it makes a certain type of sense. Okay, changing the musical key of something changes all the notes, which in which case, okay, everything is changed. But then, even if I were to change the duration of the first note, then that would change the timing of every other note afterwards, which seems to collapse this distinction because that doesn't make sense to call it the overall transformation of everything. Like if I just add a fermata at the end of my first passage, that will change the duration. It would change the timing of every other note after that fermata. So it's not a local adjustment, though it seems like it would be a local adjustment. So anyway, there's some parts of that I don't like. To me, it just seems like these are different types of knowledge. Like the relationship between things is a form of knowledge, and that can be changed. And then the overall key, that is knowledge, and that could be changed. And sometimes the key is related to the particular notes, but they don't have to be. So changes in one and the other could be arbitrarily different or isolated. Naturally, the concept of alteration is a very fuzzy one, and there are bound to be many borderline cases. The concept of alteration is, nevertheless, clearly a meaningful one, since given any work of art, we could easily think of paradigmatic examples of changes which could shatter the basic gestalt, and changes which would not. Assuming that the concept of alteration is sufficiently clear for our present purposes, let us look again at the claim about testability or justifiability of aesthetic value judgments. We have suggested that alternatives which are inferior to a given work of art could be seen as confirming evidence for claims about its rightness, while superior alternatives would count as disconfirming instances of such aesthetic value judgments. However, the determination of whether an alteration or an alternative is superior or inferior to a given work of art also involves aesthetic value judgment. But if this is so, isn't our suggestion about the justifiability of aesthetic value judgments circular? Aren't the judgments which are to be justified involved in the identification of their confirming or disconfirming instances? The answer is that although certain kinds of aesthetic discriminations or value judgments are indeed presupposed, these are different from and independent of the aesthetic judgments which we want to justify. What is presupposed is that a given work of art and its alterations, one is able to judge which alteration would improve the work and which would cause aesthetic damage to it. These value judgments are comparative. Their basic logical structure is that of two-place relation, meaning work W is better or worse than work W prime. The aesthetic value judgments which we want to justify are cardinal or categorical judgments, and their basic logical structure is that of simple or complex one-place prediction, meaning work W is right or wrong, or work W is right to the degree in. Judgments of alterations and judgments of aesthetic value of works of art are thus judgments which have a different logical structure. It should also be noted that in order to judge whether an alternative work W prime of a given work of art W is better or worse than W, we neither have to assess the value of W itself nor that of W prime itself. We can determine whether W prime is better or worse than W without being committed to any particular value judgment about W. Judgments about the relative merits of alterations are thus, in this sense, independent of the judgments of the aesthetic value of works of art as such. It should be noted that comparative judgments of alterations are considerably more simple than judgments of the aesthetic value of works of art. For judging the aesthetic value of A work of art as a whole involves a judgment as to how well all of the constitutive elements or features fit together. Judgments of the aesthetic impact of alterations, on the other hand, involve two relatively simple judgments pertaining to how one of the features fits with the remaining whole and how one feature is integrated with the rest. Interesting. I guess it does make sense that there is a different logical structure of comparing works of art to an alternative of itself versus just valuing a work of art. I do see that. I do see it. I do see it. I see it. I see it. Though it does strike me as still, I see the circularity too, but I see it as different. There is a different logical structure there. It's interesting. In view of this relatively simple structure of the comparative judgments of alterations, it seems plausible that there will be considerably more consensus concerning judgments of alterations than about aesthetic judgments of works of art as such. For it seems likely that even people with different opinions about some picture, novel, or piece of music could agree to whether suggested alterations constitute improvement or damage. We can often judge with a considerable confidence whether alterations are beneficial or detrimental to a given work of art without being sure or having any definite opinion about its overall merits. I shall call such comparative judgments of alterations basic aesthetic judgments. Now, this is, it's striking me that the comparative judgments of a work of art, which is comparing like one particular feature, is doing the thing that I think is important, which is only evaluating a particular portion of a work of art, right? It's evaluating a specific substructure within a work of art and then putting the critical attitude to that substructure and not comparing the overall work of art. So it seems like there are two fundamentally different things that are happening. You can evaluate the entirety of a work of art, or you can evaluate a particular substructure within a work of art, like a particular knowledge that is embodied in the work of art. And to one way of evaluating the knowledge embodied in that work of art is to compare it to an alternative work of art with a different substructure. And that does make sense to me. It makes sense to me. But then I also think that you could just go further than that. Like there's particular knowledge embodied in a work of art, and that knowledge could be embodied in different works of art. And you could just have that knowledge be compared to the knowledge in a different work of art. Or you can have that same knowledge embodied in multiple works of art. And that could be a part of the way that you judge it. Of course, that's how I think about it. You judge the knowledge embodied in a work of art, and it doesn't matter which particular work of art that knowledge is embodied in. You just want to evaluate the knowledge broadly and see how widely that it can replicate, or how many different works of art it can survive in, or how many minds it can survive in, or the fact that it could be independently improved, and so on. If it could be, if there are many things that could go wrong with it. And I see that, again, I see that as analogous to a scientific theory. It's like saying that there's knowledge embodied in a technology. And you can have knowledge embodied in a technology. There can be knowledge of material science embodied in a rocket ship. And I don't need to compare the material science, the particular material science to, I don't need to compare the particular knowledge of material science in one rocket ship to an alternative of that same rocket ship with slightly different materials. I can compare it to all other technologies, to cars, to submarines, and so on. And if I wanted to understand that rocket ship, it would be best for me to understand the material science and the materials of that particular rocket ship, of alternatives of that rocket ship, and of the car, and of the submarine, and other things too, because material science broadly, I want to know the knowledge broadly of all those things. This comparative judgment seems to be doing that thing that I like to do. It seems to be much more in line with what I'm looking for, and not at all giving the overall judgment of the work of art itself, because that part doesn't seem to be the relevant thing or the interesting thing about a work of art. one of the main reasons why I think that trying to think about a particular work of art is not the main thing to pay attention to, because generally speaking, we don't continuously improve a particular single work of art, which means that since we don't continuously improve a single work of art, we're not getting unbounded, open-ended progress of art by evaluating and improving a single work of art. We just don't do that. But we do get open-ended, unbounded progress by evaluating the particular knowledge within works of art, because that knowledge will be spread widely into many works of art and then be independently improved when it's fitting into different environments, the different works of art being the different environments, and also different minds. I'm glad that he laid out the difference between the comparative logical structure and the total work of art evaluation logical structure. That is a very important difference. I shall call these comparative judgments of alterations basic aesthetic judgments. These basic aesthetic judgments can be conceived of as playing a role in the proposed model of aesthetic evaluation of works of art, analogous to the role of basic statements play in the Popperian model of epistemic evaluation of scientific theories. The analogy between basic aesthetic judgments and basic statements pertains both to their function and their status. Basic statements serve as confirming or disconfirming evidence for claims that a scientific theory under consideration is true. In a similar manner, basic aesthetic judgments can be conceived of as confirming or disconfirming evidence for claims that the work of art under consideration is right. Although basic statements are not considered by Popper, I just want to jump in a little bit here, because another thing strikes me again, right? A scientific theory, obviously, a scientific theory can be used in many different technologies, but a work of art is not used in different technologies. Like, a work of art isn't, you don't build upon a particular single work of art. You collect lots of different scientific theories to make a technology. And so you don't really collect a lot of different works of art to make a new work of art. You can sometimes, but that's just not how we normally think about it. This is why I just think that analogy between a work of art and a scientific theory does not work. Okay. Although basic statements are not considered by Popper as proven, non-revisable, absolutely certain, or indubitable facts, their truth value is generally considered less problematic and more easy to determine than that of the hypothesis which is tested against them. I didn't actually understand that, so I'm going to read the footnote. Testing theories by basic statements is not considered by Popper as duels between hypotheses and hard facts, but rather as high-level theories being contested by accepting lower-level theories. Okay, I still didn't understand it. Okay, I do understand what he means now. He's saying two distinct and important things. The first thing is that high-level theories are being contested by accepted lower-level theories. What he means is that in Popper's epistemology, you have universal statements, and a universal statement creates singular statements. And then those singular statements can be compared to observations. So let's give a simple example. All ravens are black is a universal statement. The singular statement would be, this raven is black. And then an observation would be, this raven is black, or maybe this raven is not black, or whatever. And certain types of observational statements will become accepted statements, which are called basic statements. And you compare the basic statement to the singular statement. So you can have a basic statement, which is that this raven is white, or this raven is pink, or whatever, it's not black. And that will contradict the singular statement, this raven is black, in which case it will contradict the higher level theory, the universal theory, that all ravens are black. Okay, there's that portion of it. And the secondary portion is that the basic statements are not brute facts. They can be changed over time or updated. So they are not brute facts. They are theories. Analogically, though basic aesthetic judgments, i.e. judgments of alterations, are not considered self-evident, they are considered less problematic and easier to determine than judgments concerning the rightness of works of art. Let us come back now to our assumption that there is likely to be more consensus at the level of basic aesthetic judgments than on the level of overall evaluation of works of art. If this assumption is true, the basic principles of our model can be suggested as a piecemeal method for aesthetic persuasion. They could be suggested as basic guidelines for a method by which an art critic could, in a piecemeal manner, demonstrate his claims concerning shortcomings or aesthetic merits of a work of art. Okay, I like this idea that you can build up some sort of aesthetic persuasion by I'm already seeing what he's talking about here. You can persuade people by giving every part of the work of art, considering alternatives, presenting it to people, saying that there's no better alternative. Okay, and then we go back to the original work of art, and then you persuade them that the work of art is right. I can see that. I like this. I like that. It's a good move. I propose, in the way that I see it, I don't really have that in the way that I see it. I have a different thing, which is you could show that the knowledge embodied in a work of art, you can show that it's new knowledge, perhaps, and that it could be independently improved, and that it can generalize to other works of art. Or you could show that the knowledge allows for new types of knowledge to be built upon on top of it, so that there's aesthetic progress. But I don't have this thing that I can show to demonstrate that a work of art is right or good, or in my own language, beautiful. Okay, section 3. One of the basic features of Popper's falsificationism is the emphasis on the methodological implications of the logical asymmetry between verification and falsification of scientific hypotheses. A single accepted basic statement about a non-black raven falsifies the hypothesis all ravens are black. No number of accepted basic statements about black ravens, however, is sufficient for verification of this hypothesis. With a certain amount of simplification, we may thus conclude that while we may know that certain hypotheses under consideration is false, we can never know whether it is true. Right? This is the idea that universal statements can never be verified, they can only be falsified. Because you could never look at every single raven, assuming that ravens are some sort of universal thing. Now, I think that's just a toy example. I don't actually think it's true. You could just look at all ravens. But anyway, assuming you had some sort of universal statement that would be literally impossible to actually test every single case, there's no number of verifications or corroborations that confirm the theory. So it's never possible to be verified, but any counterexample would falsify it. So you can only falsify a universal statement. There's also the difference between, so a universal statement entails an existential statement, which means that a universal statement, all ravens are black, entails means it implies that there is a existential statement, such as this raven is black. You just pick a particular raven, and this raven is black. And then it also entails another more general existential statement, which is there is a black raven. This existential statement can never be falsified. It can only be verified. It has the other opposite asymmetry there. So if I just say there is a black raven, you could never prove that wrong, because to prove wrong that there is a black raven means that you have to have knowledge of literally everything in the entire multiverse, which again is just an impossible feat. But you could verify it by finding any black raven. There exists a black raven. So just find a black raven and there you go. You've proven this existential statement. So obviously, oh, it's not that obvious. Okay, so the existential statement is not very logically strong because it doesn't imply anything. But the universal statement is extremely logically strong because it implies the statement that any particular raven that we find is black, right? So this raven is black is implied by all ravens are black. And then there exists a black raven is also implied by the statement all ravens are black. So the universal statement implies multiple different logical statements, which means that it is a logically stronger statement. So you want to have universal statements. And if you have a universal statement, they can never be verified, they can only be falsified. So that is the importance of this asymmetry. It's a logical asymmetry of universal statements and existential statements. I want to suggest that basically the same asymmetry pertains to the judgments of rightness and wrongness of works of art, or even to the judgments of rightness and wrongness of its constitutive features. For in order to establish that feature F is in its right place, meaning that it is a good making feature, we have to survey all of its alternatives and determine that they are all inferior to F. It would be, however, sufficient to find a single aesthetically superior alternative of F in order to show that F is not quite right. Okay, the phrase good making feature is just so silly. It makes sense. This asymmetry between the verification and falsification of claims about the rightness of features applies to a fortiori applies a fortiori to the claims about the rightness of works of art as such. I'm going to reread that sentence. I don't know what a fortiori is. I'm going to look up what a fortiori is. I'm going to look it up first. A fortiori is a Latin phrase. It means with even stronger reason, or all the more so. If he can run 5 miles, then he can run 2 miles, a fortiori. Okay, there you go, a fortiori. I wonder if it's a or a. I don't know Latin. A fortiori. Anyway, we're going to say a fortiori. This asymmetry between the verification and falsification of claims about the rightness of features applies a fortiori to the claims about the rightness of works of art as such. I still don't understand this. I don't understand why, if we can determine the a fortiori, I don't understand why, if we can determine the rightness or wrongness of a particular feature, it implies the rightness or wrongness of an entire work of art. So he's saying that if you can find the rightness or wrongness of a particular feature within a work of art, then obviously, even more so, then you can prove the rightness, you can show the rightness or wrongness of the entire work of art. So if you can show the rightness of all the features, then you can show the rightness of all the features of the entire work of art. If you can show the wrongness of any of the features, then you can show the wrongness of the entire work of art. I don't know if that follows. That's interesting. Again, I just think it's weird to think about the wrongness. So I take it back to the analogy of a technology, right? I can show, for example, we can look at a technology. Oh man, how do we do this? Like, we can look at a technology that only uses Newtonian mechanics. And if we have a technology that only uses Newtonian mechanics, then we have an evaluation of that technology, and we can evaluate that technology by looking at one of the features of that technology, which is like the knowledge that it's embodying. And we can show that Newtonian mechanics is wrong because Einsteinian mechanics is correct. And therefore, if we show that the knowledge embodied in it is wrong by using Newtonian mechanics, it's wrong for using Newtonian mechanics, it would be better if it used Einsteinian mechanics. Does that mean that we've shown that the technology itself is also wrong? I don't get it. I don't see it. I'm not seeing it. Maybe we can, but I'm not seeing it. Like it's almost there. Like it's like at the edge of my. I can almost agree to it, but I don't think so. But I can almost agree to it. I would have to think of like looking at a work of art, and I can see that the work of art uses, let's say, uses the rule of thirds. And I just know that the rule of thirds is worse than using dynamic symmetry or using the harmonic armature. There are other like better ways of organizing images in a frame, in organizing the subject of images in a frame. So because this feature is worse, the work of art is automatically worse. I'm like almost there. Like I'm almost there. Like I can almost agree to it. Almost though. Okay. We could thus say that while we may know when a work of art under consideration is wrong, we can never be sure that it is right. Okay, that is, the whole point of this was just the asymmetry. Yes, we can understand when a work of art is wrong, not when it is right. I believe this asymmetry manifests itself in everyday contexts. Think, for example, of the following situations. In front of you is an exquisite work of art, and you are asked to explain to somebody who does not perceive it as such why it is so good. Compare this to the situation in which you are faced with a bad work of art, and you have to explain again to somebody who does not perceive it as such why it is bad. From my own experience, it seems to me that we find it much more difficult to explain why a good work of art is good than to explain why a bad work of art is bad. In the first case, we often feel completely at a loss. We don't know where to start. We might often feel like saying, either you see it or you don't. Oh God, don't do that. There is not much one can do by way of arguing, demonstrating, or pointing to features. That is aesthetic pessimism. I don't like that pessimism there. Okay, well we're gonna move past. He's just giving an example. Okay, we're gonna keep going. Okay, I'm triggered, but we're gonna keep going. For to show or to explain that a work of art is right, one would have to demonstrate that no alternative would improve it. But to do this, one would have to go over all alternatives of a given work, which seems an almost impossible task. That is not okay. We're gonna dwell on it for just one moment. I think that's just not right. There's no way you don't have to go through every single thing about the work of art to show that it is a good work of art, and no one would expect you to do so. And I don't think that one person finding a single fault would be enough to show that it's a bad work of art. But he's saying specifically in the case of trying to persuade somebody, when to persuade somebody you have a good work of art, I think you just show that some of the features are good. Again, I just don't like the whole notion of the work of art being good. But you can just show that there's knowledge embodied in the work of art, and that knowledge is valuable, and it can be generalized to other works of art. It can help you better appreciate other works of art. It can be the foundation of further beauty that can be built upon from that feature of the work of art, and so on. I think you can just do that. I think you can do that pretty effectively if you know things about the work of art, and especially if you know things about the mind of the person who you're talking to, because that's a major factor. And you can build up all the appropriate prerequisite knowledge that is necessary to be able to appreciate the features in the work of art, meaning that they can notice and replicate those features. Anyhow, okay. I think I'm going into too much detail. It's not that important. What's important is he thinks it would be an impossible task because you would have to show everything, all the features of the work of art, and show that they are all right in order to show that the work of art is good. And that is an important asymmetry because you only need to show one feature is wrong to show that the work of art is bad. He didn't say that, but I think he's going to get into that. To explain what is wrong with a given work of art, on the other hand, may simply consist of suggesting a single beneficial alteration, which ipso facto points to a deficiency. Got it. Yep. Okay, as expected. Let us now consider two likely objections. The first pertains to the somewhat skeptical, or at any rate, negativist consequences of the asymmetry between justification of positive and negative aesthetic value judgments. For it seems to follow that although we may explain deficiencies of a work of art, it is practically impossible, owing to the vast number of alternatives to be surveyed, to justify claims about the merits of a work of art. The proposed method for justification of aesthetic value judgments thus seems severely limited. Okay, first objection, you can't justify it. Okay. The second objection could be stated as follows. According to the conclusion reached in section 1, Any alteration which is detrimental to a given work of art should be considered as a confirming instance of the positive aesthetic judgments. Any detrimental? Okay. Every such alteration should, to some degree, raise the probability of the claim that the work of art under consideration is right. It should serve as a piece of positive evidence for such claims. All right, we're just going to have to go into epistemology and just talk about justificationism and probabilistic, Bayesian epistemology. All right, it always boils down to that, doesn't it? Yet, this does not always agree with our intuitions. Imagine that an art critic who wants to justify his positive assessment of Canaletto's paintings of Venice would urge us to compare them with alternatives in which the sky would be painted green. Right. That is clearly a silly alternative. We would readily agree that such alternatives would be aesthetically inferior, yet we would be reluctant to accept them as positive evidence or genuine confirmation evidence of the claim that these paintings are aesthetically valuable. For, given any work of art, we could easily conjure up all sorts of clearly inferior alternatives, yet we would feel that they reveal nothing about the actual aesthetic qualities of the work. Both problems are, I think, readily resolved by adopting Popper's conception of cooperation, or genuine confirmation, which also lends itself to adaptation to aesthetics. For Popper, a theory is genuinely confirmed only if it is genuinely tested by an attempt to falsify it, and this attempted falsification turns out to be unsuccessful. Let me quote Popper again. Confirming evidence should not count except when it is the result of a genuine test of the theory, and this means that it can be presented as a serious but unsuccessful attempt to falsify the theory. How are we to translate this principle to our aesthetic model? To falsify a theory is to falsify the claim that the theory is true by pointing to a counterexample. But what does it take to falsify the claim that a work of art, W, is just right? The aesthetic counterexample to such a claim would consist in producing an alternative, or version of W, which would be aesthetically superior to W. Popper's principle could thus be translated to our model as follows. Aesthetically inferior alterations of a work of art W should not count as evidence for positive judgment of W, except when it constitutes a genuine test of W, and this means that it can be presented as a serious but unsuccessful attempt to improve W. This means that only such alterations which could prima facie be seen as serious candidates for improvement should be taken into consideration, and only when such alternatives turn out to be, after inspection, aesthetically inferior after all, do we have a genuine confirmation of a positive aesthetic claim. The adoption of Popper's principle drastically reduces the number of aesthetic claims. It not only rules out such freaky alternatives as the one with the green sky in Canaletto's pictures, since even before actually comparing them to the original work, we would not consider such alternatives as serious candidates for improvement. It also rules out alterations which do not conform to the general conception of the work, to its stylistic particularities, and to its inner logic and spirit. By restricting relevant alternatives to those which could prima facie be credible candidates for improvement, the range of alternatives with which one has to compare a given work of art in order to justify its positive assessment need not be unmanageably large. If this is so, it should be, at least under some circumstances, practically possible for an art critic to demonstrate or explain his positive assessment of a work under consideration. By juxtaposing alternatives, an art critic should be able to convince his audience about the work's merits. He should be able to bring it about that his audience sees what is to be seen in a worthwhile work of art. Let me illustrate this by example from my own experience. Recently, I was present at a musical evening where a musicologist was analyzing Beethoven's Sonata No. 7 Opus 10, number 3 in D major. At one point, he said that the second phrase of the first movement, I don't know what BB stands for, but this is a measure 4 through 10, constitutes a brilliant and ingenious breaking of the rhythmic symmetry of the whole phrase, which enhances the aesthetic value of the piece. Some of the less musical people in the audience, including myself, did not quite see this at first. I thus asked the musicologist if he could explain what is so good about this phrase. Instead of a verbal explanation, he suggested a number of alternatives to the passage in question. He played the first movement with certain alterations. Although these alterations complied with the canons of the classical sonata and were executed in the spirit of Beethoven's work, they were clearly recognized by all as aesthetically inferior. And those who, at the beginning, didn't quite grasp the beauty of the first movement began to see it quite clearly. After listening to 4 or 5 such alternative versions, everybody was convinced that the musician had justified and convincingly demonstrated his claim. That's interesting. I want to now listen to Beethoven's Piano Sonata number 7, just for my own enjoyment.
Now, Opus 10, number 3, to me, one of the miracles of music. The first movement is presto, alla breve, so you are counting 2 in a bar, and
Okay, I see what he means about breaking the rhythmic symmetry of the whole phrase. And also, it's just like such a bizarre form. It's like, anyway, I don't want to go into this. I remember reading about this one specifically in Schoenberg's book as one of the weird hybrid phrases. Anyway, it's got this like mirrored structure. It's so cool. But anyway, not relevant to what we're talking about. It's almost a little bit relevant, but it's not super relevant. Okay, I just like it. All right. I can see what he means. I can see that if you played many different variations of it. I wonder what the alternative versions were, because I wonder if he made the alteration of measures 4 through 10 and then had those variations mirrored in measures 11 through 16. I think it would be. There's no need to go into all the detail there. I can understand having alterations and alternatives is a way of demonstrating that it is beautiful or good or right. This adapted Popperian principle, which stipulates that only alterations which would prima facie be seen as credible candidates for improvements are to be considered as relevant. It makes somewhat heavy demands on the art critic. For if the art critic wants to engage in aesthetic persuasion, as suggested here, he wants to bring his audience to see what is to be seen in works of art. He has to be armed not only with a considerable amount of art historical knowledge, he also has to have a certain amount of creative imagination. The creative imagination required from the art critic is not the same as the creative imagination required from the practicing artist. We need not to expect the art critic to be able to produce or even conceive of original works of art. The creative imagination expected from the art critic is confined to the ability to suggest alterations of existing works of art, alterations that would prima facie be acceptable as credible candidates for improvement. But even this may not be an easy task, especially when it comes to really good works of art. But it helps to understand the works of art. So this is like a great thing, because there are some art critics I just like to call them art appreciators because I don't know why we need to have a different. I mean, I feel like criticism and appreciation are kind of the same word, but just opposites, mirror images. And I like people who appreciate works of art and they can show you, they can teach you how to appreciate works of art. Of course, I mentioned Schoenberg a second ago because he's got he teaches musical forms like phrase structure for themes, like specifically that theme. Another person is William Kaplan. He does similar things. He's improved upon Schoenberg's theories. We have Andras Schiff. He's got a great series on Beethoven's piano sonatas where he goes through every single piano sonata and goes through every single movement of the piano sonatas and explains all the themes within them. So anyway, there are ways to improve the way that a audience can listen to music or, can appreciate any work of art, in which case it makes it easier for you to imagine differences. You can immediately be able to, like, if you don't understand music theory and you don't understand what's going on in the work of art and how these different parts are mirrored in different, if you don't understand that particular theme, for example, is mirrored, like has two different sections that are mirrored over each other, or if you don't understand, how the exposition section is going to be repeated and how the particular themes that are exposed in the exposition section are going to be a kind of varied in the development section. If you don't understand all those things, then you don't understand what minor changes are going to affect different parts of the work of art. You don't understand the constraints that each particular section or each particular theme in a work of art has on other parts of the work of art. So if you don't understand all that, then it makes it difficult to, understand the alternatives. But someone who can teach you that is actually just pretty simple. You can just read the book, or you can listen on your own and try to figure out how things are related to each other. All of those things are learnable and pretty easily learnable. And they make for a better audience because then you can have a better critical attitude for works of art. Anyway, this is all aesthetic progress. Learning to appreciate works of art better leads to aesthetic progress, because then the audience has higher fidelity awareness of what's going on in a work of art, which gives the artists more availability, more potential to embed more knowledge in their work of art. So they have more beauty. The work of art is more beauty apt, or there are more things that could go right in the work of art. Of course, there are also more things that could go wrong in the work of art. So you increase the falsifiability of a work of art by increasing the audience's awareness of what is happening in the work of art. Anyway, I say that because I think it is an easy task. He says it's not such an easy task. I think it is an easy task to figure out which alterations are in the spirit of the original work of art and count as credible candidates for improvement. You just have to improve as an audience member and understand those things. All right, section 4. When we evoked in section 1 the notion of aesthetic falsifiability, we noted that good works of art are more falsifiable than bad ones, in the sense that it is easier to spoil them and harder to improve them by alterations of its constitutive features. Now let us try to express this intuition in a more orderly manner. Let us assume that each work of art, W, has some definite number, K, of alternatives, that it can be altered in K different ways. Each of these alterations must fall into one of the following categories. Either the alteration, A, causes some aesthetic damage to work W, or B, aesthetically improves work W, or C, does not aesthetically affect work W. So let A, B, and C stand in for the number of alterations which fall into those categories A, B, and C, respectively. The idea that the degree of falsifiability can serve as a measure of aesthetic worth can now be expressed as follows. And there's a formula. You'll be able to read this on screen, but I'll also just say it out loud. The value of a work of art, this is the V of a work of art, function V of W, is equal to A minus B, A being the number of alterations which cause aesthetic damage, minus the number of alterations which improve it. So the value of a work of art is equal to the number of changes that cause aesthetic damage minus the changes that improve it. So the greater the number of the aesthetically damaging alterations, A, and the smaller the number of the beneficial alterations, B, then the greater the aesthetic value, V, of the work of art, W. The aesthetic value of a work of art could thus be tentatively seen as directly proportional to the number of its A-type alternatives minus the number of B-type alternatives. A, remember, is the damaging type alternatives versus the improving type alternatives. I would like to suggest that the above formula captures the basic intuitions pertaining to the classical notion of unity. For a maximally unified work could only be spoiled but not improved by alterations. Accordingly, the value of a work of art reaches its highest value when B equals 0, and while A is maximally large. So the number of alternatives that improve the work of art is 0, and the number of alternatives which spoil the work of art is maximally large. It also accords with our intuitions that the unity decreases when the number of B-type alternatives increases at the expense of A-type alternatives. And this is when the work of art can be improved in many ways but damaged in only a few ways. While proposing the above formula as an explication of the concept of unity, I do not think it reflects the overall structure of our aesthetic value judgments. For we do not judge the aesthetic merits of a work of art only by ascertaining how unified or well-balanced they are. A minimalist painting of a black circle in the center of a white canvas may well be so executed that it could only be damaged but not improved by alterations, meaning it would be optimally unified. This does not mean, however, that we would admire it as a supreme artistic achievement. The reason is that such a painting lacks the dimensions of complexity and intensity, which are both positive factors in the overall aesthetic evaluation. What we admire in art is not simply unification per se, but harmonization or unification of highly complex and intensive forms. Complexity and intensity should thus be represented as amplifying factors to the unity component of our formula. Let me start with the complexity factor. From Aristotle to Monroe C. Beardsley, complexity has been thought of in terms of heterogeneity and multidimensionality. The more complex a work of art, the greater the plurality and diversity of its constitutive features. I suggest that these intuitions can at least partially be accounted for by representing the degree of complexity by the total number of alternatives, meaning by the number of ways in which the work of art could be altered without shattering its perceptual gestalt. The degree of which complexity could thus be represented in our schema modeled by K, or which comes out to be the same by the sum of A plus B plus C, the number of alterations which will make a work of art worse, the number of alterations which will make a work of art better, and the number of alterations which would not affect the aesthetic value of a work of art. Our formula should thus be amended as follows. And here's the formula on screen, you can see it. It's the value of a work of art, V of W is equal to A minus B times A plus B plus C. Let us consider some examples. Though there may be notable differences in complexity between different sonatas, quartets, and symphonies, on the whole, we judge symphonies to be more complex than quartets, and quartets are more complex than sonatas. We might say that the number of different instruments enhances the complexity of the work, but we could also say that the increases in the number of instruments employed increases the number of ways in which the piece might be altered without altering its basic gestalt. That's interesting. I don't think that's, I wonder if that's strictly, is it true? I guess it might be true. Revisions, let's see. The reason why I'm hesitating here is because it's not really the amount of, it's not really the amount of instruments that matters. Like you can't have, of course, you have symphonies that have like 80 instruments playing at the same time. And then you have like a quartet, which has 4, or a quintet, which has 5. But that's not really where the complexity lies, because in a symphony, you really have the string section, and then you have a wind section, and then you have a brass section. And that's just 3 sections, right? And if you have 3 sections, you have a trio, you have 3 instruments. Those are equivalent. Now, usually it's a little bit more fine-grained. You usually have a string section, which has violin, cello, viola, bass. So those 4. And then you have the wind section, which has the flute and the blah, 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 clarinet sometimes. You get what I'm saying? There's different instruments in each section. And then then you have more complexity going on. Okay, sure. But not all symphonies actually use all of that complexity. And it's not like structurally relevant. So in that case, it's not really that complex. But then you might have a very simple trio, or I just stick with trio because that's kind of the limiting case. You have a trio where you have a violin, let's say a violin, a cello, and a piano. I like piano trios. You have a violin, a cello, and a piano, and then you have so you have those 3 sections going, those 3 sections independent of each other. But then you also have the grouping. So you have a violin and the cello against the piano, and they form a different type of section. And then you have the violin and the cello and the piano working together, and they form different. So there are different forms of groupings that you can do. And usually in the trio, those things are all exploited. We have the violin playing, and then the cello and the piano work together as an accompaniment. And then that's like a conflict, those two groupings. And then you switch, and then you change it, and then now you have the cello and the violin working together, and the strings are in conflict with the piano, and then we have that different type of thing. And you have all these different things that kind of float around and change. Whereas, of course, that does happen with symphonies. But what I'm saying is that it doesn't necessarily happen with symphonies. So anyway, all right, I think I'm just pointing out that some symphonies can be less complex than some trios. And I think he's granting that anyway, so I don't need to even be talking about this. He's saying that generally, most of the time, usually, symphonies are more complex than quartets. Okay, I can agree to that. And oh my God, I love the more complex, like I like symphonies and all. Symphonies are great, but we gotta ramp it up sometimes. Give me a concerto, give me a solo piano with a symphony, and they can have those battle between those two. And then give me a double concerto, and give me a triple concerto where you can have a piano trio versus a symphony. And there's so many different groupings that come available and are very interesting and relevant and fun. And my God, I love it. That's not what we're talking about today, though. So we're going to move on beyond that. We'll stick with the fact that, yes, generally, more instruments, as we're going to say here, we could say that the increase of instruments employed increases the number of ways in which the piece might be altered without altering its basic gestalt. Oh, that's interesting. So we can say that the number of different instruments enhances the complexity of a work of art. Great. But we could also say that the increased number of instruments employed increases the number of ways in which the piece might be altered without altering its basic perceptual gestalt. Revisions in a passage of a single instrument in a symphony is unlikely to affect its basic structure. So I think that's so silly. Like I think he literally means a single instrument in a symphony, and that would totally destroy the basic structure. If you have a symphony this happens occasionally where you have a symphony that has a solo, like a violin will do a solo section. And it's just bizarre. It would just be very weird to do, like not a concerto, just a symphony that has a solo violin piece, a portion. That would actually completely throw off the entire gestalt of a symphony. And it does happen sometimes. And what I'm saying is that it's very weird, and it would be like extremely noticeable from a person who listens to symphonies often. So if you were to have various parts of if you were to like have a string section where all of the strings play different things, let's say if you have a string section where you have first violin, second violin, and then you have viola and cello, if you were to just point out the cello section and you had all of the cellos play something different. So let's say you have 6 cellos. I think that's a lot for a typical symphony, but let's just say you have 6 cellos and all 6 of them are playing different notes. That would be very strange. Usually all of the cellos play the same thing. So in this case, the revision of a passage of a single instrument in a symphony, to me, it does change the basic structure. But we're just going to follow along, okay? I'm adding too much nuance here. We're going to follow along with Tomas Kulka is going on about. We understand what he means, broadly speaking. Let's say it doesn't change the overall basic structure. Okay. So that means that you can change various small things in a symphony. You can change more without changing the overall gestalt. Okay. A comparative revision of a passage in a quartet or a sonata, however, might change the overall basic structure. It's funny because it's actually the exact opposite, right? I think it's just not true. Like if you have a piano trio and then you decide to change a little bit of what the violin is doing, that doesn't change the whole basic structure of the piano trio, because you expect the violin to be doing something different than the cello and the piano. So it might, I mean, it'll definitely change something, but it doesn't change the overall structure. Okay. But anyway, we're just going to keep going. Okay. A comparative revision of a passage in a quartet or sonata, however, might. Similarly, novels will in general permit more alterations than short stories or poems. Accordingly, they could be regarded as more complex. Likewise, it could be argued that owing to the abundance of ornamental and other subsidiary elements, Baroque structures allow for more alterations than Byzantine structures. Accordingly, we generally judge Baroque churches to be more complex than Byzantine churches. Okay, I don't know what a Byzantine versus a Baroque structure looks like, so I'm not even sure which one he means is the ornamental one. It doesn't. Resisting the urge to look it up. I don't think it matters. Okay, I understand the general point. If something has more elements, it can be more complex, but it allows for more changes, which are neutral. Complexity is thus conceived as the total number of alterations a work of art can be subjected to, which do not destroy the overall gestalt. Another way to express the same idea is to think of the degree of complexity as the number of ways in which a work of art could potentially go wrong. This brings us back to the idea of falsifiability. For we may also say that the degree of complexity of a work of art is directly proportional to the number of its potential falsifiers, meaning the number of ways the work of art could be altered and thus potentially spoiled. The degree of complexity could, in this way, be seen as a degree of potential falsifiability. And this could be contrasted with the degree of unity, which, in our Popperian terminology, should be designated as the degree of actual falsifiability. For in order to assess the degree of complexity of a work of art, we only have to know what should count as its potential falsifiers. We do not have to know what should count as actual falsifiers, or which of the alterations would actually spoil rather than improve it. In order to assess the degree of unity, however, one has to assess the number of alterations which would actually damage the work, the number of ways in which the work would actually go wrong. The degree of unity could thus be seen as proportional to the number of actual falsifiers. Let us now turn to the concept of intensity. What are the intuitions associated with this notion? One could say that intensive works leave a strong aesthetic impact. They are highly expressive, as a rule. Works of art which strikes us as highly intensive are very tightly and economically organized. All the constitutive elements function aesthetically. There are very few redundancies. It should be noted that high intensity, just like high complexity, is not in and of itself a guarantee of rightness. Highly intensive works can be both good and bad. Indeed, extreme beauty and extreme ugliness are both aesthetically highly intensive, highly expressive. I suggest that the degree of intensity could be represented as a ratio between the number of aesthetically significant alterations, which is just A plus B, and the number of aesthetically neutral alterations, which is just C. That is by this ratio of A plus B over C plus 1. Our formula should thus be further amended as follows. Okay, let me think about this. A plus B over C plus 1. I've thought about this before. I've mentioned it before in one of my other videos, this specific formulation of intensity. A plus B are the alterations which are aesthetically relevant, and you divide that by C plus 1. Of course, you do divide it by C plus 1 because if there are no neutral alterations, then you have 0, and if you divide by 0, then you have a maximally valuable work of art, which doesn't seem to make sense. If you want to have a rigorous formula about this, it's just like infinitely valuable. Okay, so if a work of art has no neutral alterations, but only positive and negative alterations, it is maximally intense, right? We're getting close to the idea of something that is hard to vary, by the way. We're getting close to, the intensity is hard to vary. I think intensity and unity together make the notion of hard to vary. So if you have a work of art that is only possible to spoil, and you have no possible improvements and no possible neutral alterations, then the work of art is hard to vary. Okay, so the formula is on screen. You can see the formula. It is not formatted very well, but you can imagine this. You can imagine the fraction is lowered down so it's in line properly. Okay. Let us now look at some examples. We have noted above that novels should be, on the whole, considered more complex than poems. We didn't want to imply, however, that novels are therefore a priori likely to be better than poems. The point is that the lower complexity of poems is likely to be compensated by higher intensity. The reason of this is, imagine taking a novel and replacing each noun or verb, for that matter, by its synonym, assuming there is a synonym. Each such replacement is likely to count as an alteration, meaning it is likely to preserve the basic structure of the work. Some such alterations might conceivably damage the novel, and some might improve it, but it is quite clear that the vast majority of such alterations would not aesthetically affect the work. Let us now imagine doing the same thing to a poem. Admittedly, some such replacements might not count as alterations since they might shatter the basic gestalt of the poem. The point is that only relatively few of these replacements that would count as actual alterations would be aesthetically insignificant. The number of aesthetically neutral alterations is likely to be vastly outnumbered by the number of aesthetically significant alterations in a novel. This means that the intensity component, the A plus B over C plus 1 component of poems, is going to be relatively high compared to that of novels. Even a very bad poem is likely to be relatively highly intense, such that any change will completely destroy it. There's not the possibility of many neutral changes in a poem. He doesn't explain why, but it's, poems sometimes they rhyme, or that the meter is important, or the rhythm is important, or the the structures and all that kind of stuff is important. So if you just change it with a different word, then you might not have a rhyme somewhere, or you might not have the stresses be on the right beats, or you might completely change the meter, that type of thing, and that would destroy the poem. I think it would destroy the, it would destroy the poem. But yes, so that would just destroy the poem. Does it matter that those are, what I'm trying to imagine is, because remember we had the earlier case of the painting, and if you just paint the sky green, it doesn't really count as a valid alteration. But I think that only mattered for unity, but it should matter for all of them because it's using the same variable, A and B and C. So that's interesting. If we just consider various random changes of a poem, well, I guess it doesn't matter. What's important is that it would be difficult to find aesthetically neutral alterations. It doesn't particularly matter that it's difficult to find also positive alterations and worse alterations. What's important is that it's difficult to find aesthetically neutral alterations. So perhaps just blanket replacing random words with synonyms in a poem won't work, and they probably likely won't even be considered viable alternatives because they change so much of the rhythm and they don't rhyme and so on. There will be some that are positive changes, and there will be very few that are neutral changes. Okay, I got it. That makes sense. Let us, for argument's sake, try to challenge this claim. Let's try to imagine a poem with an extremely low intensity. What would this mean? It will mean that almost every alteration of such a poem would leave us aesthetically indifferent. That means that no alterations would improve or damage its aesthetic appeal. But a little reflection shows that this is impossible. Well, is it impossible? It is not that such a poem would be extremely bad. It wouldn't be a poem at all. Indeed, we would hardly relate to it, such an entity, as a work of art, for it could hardly be said to be functioning aesthetically at all. Our hypothetical example indicates that a certain minimal measure of intensity is a sine qua non for being a candidate of aesthetic appreciation or for the title of a work of art. I don't know what sine qua non or sine qua non means. A lot of Latin today we're learning. Sine qua non means without which not, means it's an essential element or prerequisite. So a minimal measure of intensity is required for to be a candidate of aesthetic appreciation, right? This brings us back to the notion of falsifiability. In section 1, we have noted that in order for an object to be considered a work of art, it must be falsifiable in principle, meaning it must be possible for an object to be aesthetically damaged or improved by alterations. If all the alterations would be of the kind of C, meaning if we had no preferences with regards to alternatives of the work of art, it would effectively be unfalsifiable. And we couldn't but conclude that it doesn't function aesthetically. The degree of intensity or the degree of aesthetic functioning could be thus thought of the degree of effective falsifiability. The above considerations force us to take another look at our formula. In its present form, the formula could get the value 0 under two different sets of circumstances. One, when the number of A-type alterations equals the number of B-type alterations. That's when the number of positive aesthetic changes and the number of negative aesthetic changes are equal. And 2, when all alterations are of type C. That's when A plus B equals 0. These two possibilities, however, represent quite different situations. The first represents a state of affairs when, roughly speaking, the bad making qualities are balanced with the good making qualities. The second represents circumstances when alterations have no aesthetic impact on the work under consideration. In the first case, we can speak of a mediocre work of art, and it seems quite appropriate that the formula assigns them 0 value, since good work of art get more positive value while bad works of art get negative values. In the second case, however, we do not have, as we have seen, a mediocre or bad work of art. We have no work of art at all. It is thus inappropriate in such a case for our formula to have the value of 0. The function should be undefined, indicating that the object under consideration does not function aesthetically. This deficiency could, however, be easily amended, and our formula can be rewritten in its definitive form as follows. So we have another version of the formula, and this version has, I don't understand what's going on with the formula, but one of the intensity factor has been reciprocated. Let's look at the footnote. Footnote 18 might tell us something. We have inverted the ratio of a plus b over c plus 1 and rewritten it as 1 over c plus 1 over a plus b. For all values of a and b and c, the value of the two expressions is the same, except in the case of a plus b equals 0. I got it. When the value of the first expression will be 0, the second expression, due to indivisibility by 0, is undefined. Let me conclude with a remark pertaining to the status of the proposed model. The main purpose of the formula is to lay bare the basic logical structure of aesthetic value judgments. Its quantitative algebraic formula is not intended to suggest that one could actually calculate a number which would reflect the aesthetic value of the work of art under consideration. Rather, it is intended to show that the aesthetic value of works of art could be thought of as a function which takes alterations of different sorts as its arguments. The three components of the formula could also be seen as suggestions for explication of the classical notions of unit, complexity, and intensity. Notions which were hitherto understood only on a purely intuitive level as primitive concepts. The formula lays bare the internal structure of these concepts and reveals some interrelations and interdependencies between their constitutive elements. It should be stressed that I do not claim that we actually form our aesthetic judgments in accordance with our formula. What I claim is that the principles incorporated with our model reflect our aesthetic preferences. The proposed model should be seen as a suggestion for a rational reconstruction of our aesthetic value judgments and aesthetic preferences, just like the Popperian, and for that matter, Carnapian model should be seen as a suggestion for a rational reconstruction of epistemic value judgments and scientific preferences. Carnap didn't think that scientists who have to evaluate various hypotheses and theories actually do or should proceed by state descriptions, assessments of probability, and calculations of C star functions, nor did Popper want to suggest that scientists do or should actually count and compare potential falsifiers when they have to choose between competing theories. They saw their models as suggestions for the rational reconstruction of accepted scientific practice. They intended to show that scientific choices and preferences are reflected by and can be accounted for by normative principles of their respective models. In a similar manner, I am not suggesting that we actually do or should arrive at our aesthetic assessments by juxtaposing alternatives, sorting them into requisite classes, and calculating various algebraic functions with their cardinal numbers in accordance to our formula. What I am suggesting is that accepted aesthetic judgments and preferences are reflected and can be accounted for by the normative principles incorporated by our model. All right, that was Tomas Kulka. Yay! An outline of a Popperian aesthetics. I understand it pretty well. It's not that difficult to understand, actually. I still have my issues with it in terms of having the analogy between a work of art and a scientific theory. So I'd want to flesh out more clearly why I think that fails. I think I have a clear idea of why it fails, but I have not explained it, I think, in one place very clearly. So I want to develop that understanding of why we should not look at an entire work of art and we should look at parts within a work of art. I think a little bit of this helps with that, so I'm glad I read it. In any case, this is one attempt at creating a Popperian aesthetic theory. And I'm sure there are many such more. Okay, probably not that many such more, but there are some more, and we'll look into various other alternatives as we clarify my version of it and develop a more optimistic and rational aesthetic theory. Well, thanks for joining. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let me know if you have any alternative ideas, if there's something about it that you like, if there's something that you think should be changed about it, something that's wrong with his formulation of this aesthetic theory. And could you build upon it? I'd love to hear if you build upon it.